All right, so let's look briefly at public policy. This is our last unit from the class, and of course, it will be covered on the final exam. So, really, relatively quick look at this. What big concepts are behind this unit, right? Well, we know that policymaking is a cycle, right? So it's not a straight line. Policy is made, and we have this sort of agenda setting period. We identify policy that we want, any alternatives to it, we pick it, we codify it into law, and we implement it, and eventually we evaluate it. But it doesn't end at evaluation, right? If the evaluation shows that this has created a new problem, we go back to the beginning and solve that new problem. What if it's just shown that it didn't solve the problem we thought it was going to solve? Let's go back to the beginning and try to solve it again, right? Even if it solved the problem and everything's great and it caused no other problems, we're still going to have other political issues. So policy is never a straight line. And again, even if it's great and wonderful, a lot of policies will end at a certain amount of time, right? The assault weapons ban that I think I've mentioned in class before, that had a time limit on it. So Congress let it expire, right? So policy then sort of looped back around. Even if that was a perfect law, which honestly, I don't know how the policy evaluations on that went. I assume there were flaws with it, but let's say it was an absolutely perfect law. Now it's gone, it expired. So we have to start over again, right? So policy making is a cycle. And who can make policy? Well, different actors in government have different roles in the policy process, and no one person is making policy alone. Even in cases where one person has a lot of ability to act alone, say the president in making foreign policy, we know that they still cannot do everything alone. The policy-making process is long and again, cyclical. So we will see multiple actors at play. And also policy is big, right? Policy isn't just a single law or action. Policy is sort of the guidelines that tell us what laws and actions we want to have, right? So foreign policy, specifically, we looked at what different powers the president and Congress had, but we also looked more generally at what types of powers the US can use to execute foreign policy. And so there's hard power and there's soft power. Now, hard power is typically associated with military power. It's coercive power. It's getting someone to do something that they don't want to do. In foreign affairs, that's most often military power, but we can sometimes classify economic sanctions as hard power. And I think I said in class that that's sort of a newer way of conceiving of it. I would accept either if this were to come up on the exam, that hard power is just military power, or hard power is military power and economic sanctions. Now, for soft power, that's basically everything else. Every other tool the government can use is soft power. So anything non-military. And now some economic tools do fall under soft power. That's why it's sometimes a little confusing to think of hard power as economic sanctions as well, because some economic powers are under soft power, right? Especially foreign aid. But sometimes you could conceive of certain types of economic sanctions that could fall under soft power. So soft power, if hard power is getting someone to do something they don't want to do, power is basically convincing them that they want to do it, right? So it's in a way very insidious. But soft power is often associated with diplomacy, right? So we typically can make the distinction of hard power is military, soft power is diplomacy. But again, we know there's more to both. So these tools can help the government carry out foreign policy and achieve certain different goals abroad, right? Now, in domestic policy, we looked at, and I apologize, not domestic policy, one thing about foreign policy, environmental policy, right? Environmental policy can sometimes be domestic policy. for, say, setting emissions restrictions on cars in the US, or Biden just announced a policy that all government fleet vehicles and buildings will be carbon neutral by, I want to say 2025, but I could be wrong on that year. Now, that is domestic policy, right? But we talked about environmental policy in terms of global policy, so sort of foreign policy. We talked about it as a global issue, right? Environmental, climate change could be considered a tragedy of the commons because we're all costlessly, we all meaning everyone in the world, right? All these different countries, all these different people are costlessly consuming the climate. And this could ultimately lead to its ruination. But we can also think of environmental policy in terms of, say, emissions restrictions globally, right? So things like the Paris Agreement, which set targets for each country to limit emissions. That's a bit of a prisoner's dilemma, though, because it might hurt a country to actually set these targets. But there's no real cost, in at least the immediate immediate costs to continuing emissions, right? We know that ultimately it could lead to a tragedy of the commons, but in sort of immediate costs, the costs are of implementing restrictions, not of not implementing restrictions. So if the US is like, well, we don't want to hurt our economy to implement these restrictions, but we will if everyone else does, because if everyone's economy suffers a little, we're not losing our competitive edge. But what we don't want to do is hurt our economy and lose our competitive edge while everyone else is still just emitting as much as they want to emit. So we have to sort of get promises from other countries that they'll do the same thing. But other countries feel the same way about us, right? Well, we'd cut it, but if the US doesn't, what's even the point of us cutting it? The US is such a large emitter, right? So it's the prisoner's dilemma. Everyone would benefit from agreeing and cutting emissions, but how can we trust that the other person will do it, right? We saw a similar thing with shirking during the Revolutionary War and equipping our troops, right? Now, in domestic policy, we talked about healthcare policy and entitlement reform. We looked at different collective action problems for both of those, right? Healthcare policy, say in terms of free riders, and entitlement reform. Again, we looked at a prisoner's dilemma involved. And we also looked at things like the fiscal cliff and debt ceiling in economic policy, and talked about, again, the sort of prisoner's dilemma here, and that for entitlement reform and these economic issues, basically the sort of outside enforcement that you need to get people to agree is the ultimate really bad thing that's going to happen if they don't agree. So for entitlement reform, if they don't agree, at some point, Social Security will be insolvent and no one will be happy. So anything worse than being the Congress that voted to raise the retirement age, raise taxes, raise FICA taxes, and cut benefits is being the Congress that let Social Security go away, right? Because then the retirement age is whatever, and okay, maybe I guess the taxes go away, but so does all the benefit. So do all the benefits. So the only thing people will hate more than some sort of short-term readjustments to the program is the long-term program not existing, right? Same thing is true of the debt ceiling. No one's particularly thrilled with the government going into so much debt. It's not a huge deal, as we've talked about. Our debt as a proportion of our GDP is low enough that this is not a big danger. But Congress, especially the Republicans in Congress, based on their ideology, have continued to say we should not raise the debt ceiling, we should not raise the debt ceiling. But ultimately, they come to an agreement, the two parties in Congress, and raise the debt ceiling every time. Because if we don't, the global effects of that will be catastrophic. So as much as they don't want to raise the debt ceiling, they know not raising the debt ceiling will be worse, right? So we see that the sort of outside enforcement, apologies, I'm on campus, so the lights turn off. There we go. This outside enforcement can help get us out of the prisoner's dilemma. I should note for environmental policy, the outside enforcement could be sort of the catastrophe of global warming. But that's really not going to happen all at once, like Social Security going insolvent or us hitting the debt ceiling, right? So a more likely outside enforcement, that would be the UN setting enforceable restrictions on it. Now, it's pretty hard for the UN to enforce these things, so I'm not saying this would be possible, but that's one of the likely outside enforcement scenarios for that one. So you can see, again, these different policy issues help us understand why politics is important, right? How these different ideologies play into policymaking, and how party matters, and why this whole lawmaking process mattered because of the policies that come out of our government. Now, we also see that policy can help illustrate a lot of the collective action problems that we've talked about in the class. So that is it for our review. Again, there's a review sheet posted on Blackboard. There's plenty of class by class videos if you're interested in just learning more deeply about an individual topic. And feel free at any point to email me if you have questions. Good luck, and I look forward to seeing you at the exam.